It's not as sexy as one commune, but you know.
I think it's sexier using a real hand.
Stephanie, in our previous conversations, you've shared a little bit about your story and your health journey. I think each and every one of us has a health journey, but what I'm most interested in is what how your health journey has really inspired you to write this book right now, Good Stress.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for being here. Really enjoy you always, and such a treat and honor and opportunity to connect with the amazing community that you've built. Yeah, I mean, this book started out of a quest of curiosity and then ended more. So, in my last iteration as a human, I ran this concern called Wanderlust, the Wanderlust festivals that were notorious for being these wonderful amalgams of teachers and sages and mystics all gathered on mountainsides. And they were these 4-day kind of transformational immersive festivals, of course, based well-being. And, but I wasn't very well running them. And even though they were based on atop the shoulders of yoga and meditation and biodynamics and regeneration and every wellness buzzword, I was essentially living from coffee to wine o'clock. I was working my little tail off. The peak of Wanderlust, we had 68 events in 20 countries, so I couldn't even cover them all. I was living on a plane, totally insomniatic. And kind of by the end of that journey, I had developed all of the kind of presentations of modern sickness or infirmity. So count them. Let's see. They're so normal, really. That's the problem. But really 150 years ago, completely abnormal. But we've normalized things like chronic fatigue, brain fog, insomnia, agitation, inability to concentrate, need to check your phone every 36 and a half seconds, basing your self-worth in what your phone tells you. But then other sort of greater insults to my vanity, from dad bods, so sort of this inner tube of adiposity around my middle, to these kind of relatively ghastly little brown skin tags developing in my armpits. And sometimes people get them on their necks. These are, early indications of insulin resistance and diabetes. Of course, the great gynecomastia, the boobs of man, which my children never failed to bring up, and generally with the brackets of "and not A cups, Dad." Anyhow,
Oh my goodness, your
yeah,
girls. Woo.
yeah, it's just they will eventually take care of me in recompense.
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully you're aging, you're young
Yeah, I'm
is
gonna
the
outlive
plan.
them.
Yeah.
That's what I tell them now. I was like, you teased me then, but look at me. I can do 100 pull-ups. So I had all these kind of presentations, right? And at that juncture, I did not realize that these presentations were just barely upstream from what we call diseases. Really, these are clusters of symptoms that then come together in the amber of disease, of what we call diabetes or metabolic dysfunction in my case. And it wasn't really until I slapped this little disc on my triceps called a continuous glucose monitor. I have one on right now, but I have a long sleeve shirt on, so you just have to imagine
Oh,
it.
gonna have to just
Um,
imagine. Yeah.
I mean, I might take off my shirt by the end of the podcast. You never know. But this is an audio format, so it's not that sexy when you do that. And lo and behold, I peered into the app, which bounces, which is in receipt of data bouncing from this little disc that shows me my, blood sugar levels moment to moment. And I had 125 milligrams per deciliter fasting blood glucose, which is at the very, very highest end of prediabetes, as you well know, kind of the bottom end of diabetes. And whoa, that was a wake-up call. That was a bucket of ice water over my head before that was a protocol that I chose. It was a wake-up call that I was kind of living well within this nightmare and of American and Western chronic disease. And, glucose is a decent proxy for metabolic function or dysfunction, but it's downstream from insulin. So, you can actually have regulated blood sugar levels, but because your pancreas is essentially working overtime to produce enough insulin. But that was already in my rearview mirror. So, I was clearly insulin resistant and kind of on the brink of diabetes, if not diabetic. I was also, could see these postprandial spikes up to like 250 or 300, so not good. You don't want your blood sugar levels to look like the Swiss Alps. You want them to look like, I
Rolling
don't know, the
hills. Yeah.
rolling hills of
What would they
Georgia.
be? Yeah.
The rolling hills of Georgia. I think there's a Martin Luther King quote in there somewhere. Anyhow, so yes, this was a big, wake up call, as I said. So really this propelled me on this journey to understand the etiology of my own sickness, but also within the greater context of kind of the broader infirmities of modernity and how culture and particularly convenience and ease undermine our engineering and hijack our biology. I mean, if you would have told, a denizen of 1900 that we would have largely solved for smallpox, typhoid, and cholera, mostly for tuberculosis, they would have been like, oh my God, like nirvana, you're
Right.
going to
And
live
winning. We
forever,
are
right?
winning.
We're winning the game. But of course, now
We traded it in.
we traded in. Now we essentially are choosing the way that we
Yeah.
die, and with very little thoughtfulness. So
Yeah.
this was my inquest over the course of 5 years, and I embarked upon interviewing hundreds upon hundreds of doctors, and then endless kind of me search, or threw myself into my own petri dish as an N-of-1 experiment, and sifted through the grift of so much medical jargon on the internet to try to find a way to heal. And this book, in many ways, chronicles that journey.
I was thinking about your story around, co-founding and running Wanderlust. And I remember always wanting to go to an event. I had friends who were speaking at them. And I remember it just the way you painted it, this beacon of spirituality and amazing energy and really transformation. And then here you are, living off flights, hotel rooms, probably whatever you can get, running from event to event. To me, that also sounds like a lot of bad stress, not even just the convenience of modern life, but really being in a very stressed state. I mean, did it feel
Yeah.
that way for you?
100%. And, I naively took on private equity investors who sat atop a glass panopticon in Midtown and scrutinized my moves. And so there was that pressure, there was budgetary pressure. And then candidly, just the practice of running events is just inherently bad, stressful, unless you learn how to emotionally regulate. But things happen, headliners cancel, weather events happen, emails are nonstop flowing in, so, that's really was my reality. And I often joke that my foray into health and wellness took a U-turn into wealth and hellness. I was, essentially lost sight in many ways of what had inspired me in the first place. I mean, I was inspired by my wife, Skylar, to essentially democratize access to these modalities because I was following her in the bumpy road in the name of yoga, generally to the rainforest of Costa Rica. And there would be these 30-person retreats, and there would be like 28 millennial women, 2 gay guys, and me, like waking up with the sun, meditating, surfing, eating just the local food, cooking together, just living our most vibrant, vital lives. And then kind of in the depths of the Osa Peninsula, I had this inspiration that I categorized as very, very male in retrospect. I was like, how do I scale this idea? How do I create the world's biggest yoga retreat? And it was that obsession with growth and expansion that in the end really undermined a lot of my health. I lost sight of the original motivations, as many people do. And I was just kind of got caught up in the modern game of it all. And I really suffer the consequences.
I was thinking about the U-turn again, another U-turn that you took. And I don't know what the circumstances were. Maybe it was the health information that you received. Maybe just really doing a deep check and saying, wow, this is not necessarily good for me anymore. Or maybe it was a different path to take for one commune. I'm curious, but what did that look like for you? And, when you decided to recreate for one commune, how did a lot of you integrating your own health journey or good stress strategies come into play in building this, like this new opportunity opportunity to do it in a way that felt more aligned with your health and wellness versus kind of the big scalability of Wanderlust?
Yeah, well,
And not to
as
say
an
that one commune hasn't scaled in its own right.
No, no, but it's a very, very good question and something that I've pondered quite often as an entrepreneur. With Commune, I was very, very committed to creating a company that promoted wellness, but was also well on the inside. And that really, peppered every single decision that we've made around scale, around how we've built our internal teams, around how we've spent money. With Wanderlust, I was basically considered with top line. With Commune, I've just been completely focused on bottom line, on just essentially creating a business that can have impact, but that is also very, very well and self-sustaining. And, candidly, we haven't had a person really leave the company in maybe 4 or 5 years. And so building that internal integrity and strength has been very, very central to our success and our, just the well-being of the entity. And a lot of this came out of kind of spiritual inquests that I was going through at the time into Taoism, for example, which teaches a tremendous amount about leadership. And I was trying to apply those lessons to how to actually lead, a company, to essentially lead but not be really known in a way, which is a kind of a principle of the Tao, just to trust the people. If you don't trust the people, you make them untrustworthy. That's a line, from the Tao. So it was really about decentralizing decision making, really creating a lot of fluency around the core mission of the business, such that I could really let go and let people make their own decisions. And it's been wonderful not to make every decision, and not to be the smartest person in the room, to realize that other people have vast expertise that I don't have. So that's been part of it. But, obviously it was a selfish endeavor on some level because, while I was very committed to scaling and amplifying, the ideas of all these brilliant people that I've been able to platform on Commune, I was also applying all of those learnings to myself. Sitting in the sauna with Mark Hyman, picking his brain, not just for, philanthropic means, but for like, hey, what are these adversity mimetics and what does that all mean and how do I apply them to myself? Wim Hof came and stayed with us for 3 weeks, and he was the one that introduced me, every morning, whether I liked it or not, to the stress of cold, the right degree of hypothermia, for example. So yeah, for me, it's been a hands-on opportunity to learn, and it's been incredibly gratifying.
In all those experiences that you had in the interviews and really getting to understand whether it was Mark Hyman or Wim Hof or maybe it was Dr. Casey Means, what have been one of the questions I always love to ask is like, what are your non-negotiables, Jeff, when you think about creating good energy for your body and staying in a not only a state of aliveness, but just really feeling good in your body? Is cold plunging every morning before you do anything else a non-negotiable?
It is. I mean, it is part of my regimen, if you will. I mean, what I started to really ask myself is, how did I evolve? Because over hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens, of which I am included, and for millions of years of our kind of hominid ancestry, we evolved in relationship with our environment. That's how evolution works, and that's how our genome is printed. And over the course of that unfathomably large swath of time, we built adaptive mechanisms in relationship to some degree of Paleolithic stress. And a lot of those stressors have been denuded from our modern society. So when I took an honest inventory of how I was living my life, I realized that, I was part of this culture of convenience and ease, and that leads, candidly, to a lot of inconvenient truths and a lot of dis-ease. So I had to essentially reconnect with my core design, with my engineering. I'm wearing the same jeans, if you will, as my hunter-gatherer ancestors. It's just what's changed is culture, since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly accelerating in the last 50 to 70 years. It's like my body evolved in relationship to some degree of nutrient deficiency, of calorie paucity in the winter. right? That was just a normal part, a customary part of living. So our body, in its brilliance, was designed to be a little fat, in the late summer and the early fall. Why? Because it knew that winter's paucity was just around the corner. But then when I looked at my life now, I realized winter never really comes, right?
Yeah.
Because I can always order up some Chick-fil-A in the palm of my hand on a whim, and it gets delivered right to this door before the podcast is even over. So I never activate those longevity pathways and that resilience that was part of essentially the adversity of nutrient deficiency, of the fallow of winter. And so now, in the modern age, we need to self-impose those stressors that mimic our Paleolithic heritage, our Paleolithic ancestry. So what does that look like? In the case of food, that looks like a degree of calorie restriction or fasting or intermittent fasting, etc. What does that mean in terms of temperature? Because here I am in this lovely little thermoneutral studio with this brilliant little digital thermometer on the wall that knows me, that knows, oh, we'll just keep it at 72 and nice and snuggly for Jeff. But what does that do? That erodes my ability to thermoregulate. It erodes my metabolic function. So we need to be now self-impose a degree of like Paleolithic temperature fluctuation and expose ourselves to cold and to heat, to essentially take advantage of this masterful, brilliant engineering that we have. And this can apply to so many places in life, whether or not that's immersion in nature, our relationship with light, our relationship with breath, how we live in relationship to other people. I mean, a lot of the time you can just ask yourself, how did I evolve? Because my evolution shaped my design. And am I living in accordance? Am I swimming with nature's current, or am I swimming upstream? And so that began to inform a lot of ways, a lot of potential protocols. And then it was understanding the mechanism behind that then became sort of a fascination for me.
I love that. And one of the questions I was really curious about is, in the last 5 years in this beautiful journey of really not only going back and really understanding, how did I used to live? What is the evolution of this body and these genes, which are really dictating so much. They have, like I said, they haven't changed a lot in a way, in the sense that they're not budging. It's more so it's this environment that's happening around us that's driving this disease. In terms of what does that look like interpersonally with your family, with your wife, how has that shifted for you?
Yeah, well, interestingly, a lot of these self-imposed physiological stress protocols ended up having really, really potent psychosocial components to them. Aspects that I didn't even expect. So for example, let's look at a fasting protocol. So I consolidated all my consumption of food in an 8-hour window. And early on, I was actually pretty fundamentalist about it because I was in an acute situation. But then I became sort of less neurotic over time.
Once that fasting glucose and insulin got back into range, you had more wiggle.
I became metabolically flexible and I could play with the edges of it. But early on, I was pretty tight, 10:30 to 6:30, more or less. But that didn't mean that I didn't have a hankering for a Snickers at 9 p.m., right? It didn't mean that I didn't get hungry outside the window. But because I became sort of a religious disciple, if you will, to this practice, I didn't then sort of unconsciously meander over to the pantry for a bag of chips. I had to check myself. And in that checking, I had to sort of witness the provenance, the nature of the hunger itself, and untangle whether or not that hunger, that stimulus, was a biological need. Did I really need this to live? Or was it a psychological or emotional desire?
Well, you never need chips to live.
Well, yeah, fair enough. But calories, let's just say.
Okay, calories.
And I was, an apple, let's say. But that's not what I was eating in my more indolent days.
No, nothing past 8:30 or 9 is going to...
Yeah, is going to be a good choice.
Yes.
So anyhow, But, most of the time I was just eating my feelings,
Yeah,
right? I
absolutely.
was,
Or eating the day.
psychologically bothered if someone had insulted me on the gram, or I was bored, or, there was some sort of thing that wasn't going right, whatever. It was almost never a biological need, right? And kind of in that process, I cultivated this space, this sacred space between stimulus, which in this case was the hunger, and response, which was the eating or not eating. And in that space, as Viktor Frankl famously has said, lies our choice. And in that choice, our freedom, our liberation. And this was very protean in nature and could be applied to other elements of my life, because I had this craving, not to crave, which is slightly anachronistic, but being able to cultivate that space between stimulus and response allowed me to take that breath when my children, for example, would do something very irritating, as obstreperous children are likely to do. Or, when someone would cut me off in traffic, or when someone would send some vitriolic barb on social media, or when something didn't go right in the business or whatever, I had that space available to me to either react impulsively or no, just use that space to conjure a more mindful response and really examine, why are my children acting that way? What is the origin, of that behavior, and what is the most appropriate response, in reaction to that behavior. And so that really became so powerful for me. And it began to kind of punctuate all these different elements of my life. Like, did I really need Instagram? Did I really need Amazon retail therapy? Did I really need that glass of wine, etc.? And, this is why I believe oftentimes the most potent attribute of a fasting protocol or a stress protocol tends to be more mindset oriented, psychological, and not just physiological.
I love the lesson in that. I mean, that's the lesson for all of us, is that pause, that awareness.
I mean, especially
Yeah.
in this day and age, because everyone's trying to trigger you at all times. I mean, basically, we've jiggered our entire economy around attention and persuasion. That's it. So your time and focus is being commodified and unwittingly to us sold, really. That's what all media does in social media and 24-hour news media, etc. It essentially commodifies your attention and sells it. So what's going on there is that everyone's vying for your time and focus at every single moment, trying generally to tickle your human negativity bias, fear and outrage, so you click more and more and more so they can serve you up ads. That's the way essentially the ad-driven revenue model works. It's very, very insidious in that notion, in that case. So what we need to do is become more untriggerable in response to that.
And when you paint the picture, definitely the negativity bias or the outrage or the reaction, that's a stress response system. That's what I would consider to be a bad stress response system, the most insidious kind.
You totally nailed it. I mean, basically what modern media culture does is that it understands our biology and uses it against us. Because just like you said, the stress response is completely adaptive and serves our biological imperative to survive, right? Like, I go walk up in the hills here all the time. Maybe one out of every 20 times, maybe I'll run into, a coyote or a rattlesnake on the path, right? What happened? Okay, well, I have a completely normal, adaptive, involuntary stress response. I have increased heart and respiratory rate. My liver secretes glucose. It goes to my extremities, right? To flight or flee. My pupils dilate. The aperture of my attention gets very, very narrow for good reason. I become very self-obsessed and distrustful of the world around me. And then, the rattlesnake comes to the grand realization that I'm not going to be an appetizer on his buffet or whatever, and slithers off the path into the tall grasses. And what happens? I bounce back, right? I bounce back to homeostasis. My respiratory rate and heart rate, go down, and the aperture of my attention opens back up and everything. But basically, the modern world is designed such that the rattlesnake never leaves the path. So what was an adaptive response becomes maladaptive because it's chronic. And that's the difference between bad stress and good stress. Bad stress is modern and chronic. It leads to imbalances and disease. Good stress is Paleolithic. It's short. It comes and goes. And it actually enhances our ability to bounce back to homeostasis, to find balance. And understanding the difference between those two is essential.
Yeah, in all the conversation you've had about the physiological ways that we can bring hormetic stressors into the body, based on our Paleolithic genome, and I do believe that that creates, resilience in us. But what I see so often is this state of chronic stress, this state of reactivity, this state of constantly just in those worry and anxiety. And that, aside from the prediabetes, aside from the other, I mean, obviously this is a major player in potentially insulin resistance and prediabetes, but more so just creating deregulation and a life that feels challenging and hard and fearful. And so, for me, so many of the women that I'm working with are really in a state outside of, living in the temperature controlled home, and maybe they're not walking very much. They're living a sedentary life, but ultimately they're just living a very chronically stressed life. And I know that some of these hormetic, stressors that we can bring in can help regulate that, and then bringing in things like, yoga or meditation or just breath work. Those things can help as well. But in the research that you did for this book, was there anything that stood out in addressing this chronic stressed state that so many of us are just, I tell people that, you're probably, again, getting triggered many, many times a day, don't even know it. Your body's so adapted to that level of stress response. You don't even know when you're in it. You're just living it until something like a disease state shows up or major inflammatory markers. And then we treat that. We're never treating this response.
100%. In fact, I am quite certain that the source of my diabetes was equally psychological as it was physiological, or I should say, like, my diet wasn't great. I mean, I was committing quasi-carbicide, right, at that juncture. But I believe that living in a constantly stressed state was contributing to dysregulated blood sugar. I mean, and this is not some loony concept. Of course, we know that the secretion of cortisol, it tells the liver to release more glucose. And that's totally adaptive, right? For the reasons that we've already discussed. Mm-hmm. But over time, what's going to happen? Chronically elevated glucose levels is going to stress the pancreas. You're going to become, resistant to its product. You're going to become insulin resistant. Your body's not going to be able to use energy substrates like glucose and fat for energy production, and it's going to shuttle it off for storage in the form of triglycerides sitting in those wonderful adipocytes around your belly. Mm-hmm. So this is part of the etiology of disease. 100% is essentially our ability then to emotionally regulate, to use conscious top-down pressure on top of involuntary bottom-up response. And there's many ways to do that, to train yourself to be able to do that. Some are highly physiological, like getting into a 50-degree ice plunge. Like, what happens? Like, right? You get in, you gasp.
It changes your state.
Right. And what happens? You have an involuntary bottom-up response. You feel that epinephrine coursing through your brain, in through your veins. I feel it in like my neck, right? It's like I'm about to have a panic attack. And then what do you have at your disposal? Oh, you have your conscious breath, for example, where you can have some long holds. And you can bring yourself essentially back into your parasympathetic state by essentially applying top-down conscious pressure on top of this involuntary bottom-up response. You can use your prefrontal cortex to apply some sort of contemplative practice or just rationality on top of irrationality to bring yourself back into a place of homeostasis. So you can do that. This is, again, we often associate the cold plunge with, metabolic upregulation and dopamine and mood regulation, et cetera. 100%, all those things are true. But what I, again, find to be the most potent attribute that I will extol to the end of time around the cold, and I've always hated the cold, but is that it's the actual emotional regulation that you train yourself in by doing it. I often joke that, when I go to the dentist, I'm having a lot of dental work done right now. I double down on my cold plunge. And that sounds like unconnected, but when beautiful Dr. Nikki, my dentist, who I love, hate, has this 12-inch syringe about to plunge into the most sensitive part of my body, my mouth, right? And I can't get away and I can't do anything about it. That sensation in my body is very, very similar to what's happening when I immerse myself in 50-degree water, or 45-degree water. It's that rush of epinephrine, that involuntary stress response. But now I've got the tools, push back down on it. And again, there could be nothing more useful in today's age than this ability to bring yourself back to center, to engage in the training and the techniques that help you foster sort of dynamic homeostasis. So yeah, for sure, the ice bath, but of course, breath work, meditation techniques, all of these things are so useful for this purpose.
No, I agree. I 100%. I was curious. I don't like cold either.
Yeah.
And I don't do
Well,
cold plunging as much as you, but that is one thing I really tapped into was my breath in those
mhm.
moments, where the body thinks it's going to die. That's
Yeah.
ultimately what's happening in a cold plunge. your body's moving, blood into the central, system, taking blood from the extremities. Like it is, your body's definitely going into a state of stress. And how do you regulate that in that moment? The other thing I think about too is, sending the brain safety signals throughout the day. And whether if you have a cold plunge or not, or maybe you do it in the shower, or you use a sauna, or like you said, some of the other strategies that you can use, like how do you get yourself to center? And one of the things I always teach my ladies is just letting the brain know everything's okay, like nothing's wrong to begin with. And so whether that's walking out in nature or that's breath or whatever it is, you got to just let the brain know we do not need to be freaking out over the next thing that's coming, which is everything, to be honest. Did I turn off the lights, whatever it may be?
Yeah, it's a nonstop asteroid field coming at us. I think you're right. Nature can be such a useful tool in this regard because, it has all of these different attributes to it. But, like research is very, very consistent that it lowers stress hormones. I think actually, kind of interestingly, crying is a wonderful emotional regulation technique. In fact, and we often kind of villainize it or stigmatize it, right, as something weak, as an indication of weakness. If you actually study the chemistry of emotional tears, and there's different kinds of tears, there's sort of basal tears that just kind of keep you lubricated, and kind of
The onion
induced tears, reactive tears. But these emotional tears are actually fascinating. If you actually put them in a lab, you'll actually find that they have adrenocorticotropic hormone in them, ACTH, which is a stress hormone.
Yeah,
so when you're crying, you are literally flushing out stress from your body. And of course, oftentimes when you're really crying quite acutely, you're forced to take deep breaths, right? And we just discussed, breath regulation can really move you back into center and emotionally regulate you. So crying, I think, is actually a wonderful, adaptive, pre-programmed mechanism for emotional regulation. Quite amazing. And the body is kind of full of these. It's funny to kind of also watch to see what other animals do. So obviously a lot of other animals, we often associate this with possum and I think dogs, they shake, right? Afterwards. Or, gazelles, for example, they'll run for miles and miles, even after a predator has left, even after they've escaped predation. The chimps and other primates tend to groom themselves and each other. So try that with your partner. You guys can groom each other.
Out of the stress response system. I love it.
Why not? You can just do a little grooming, a little primping. Wolves, actually, they howl. Howling is a form of sort of reestablishing social homeostasis for wolves. That's why they do it together, generally after some sort of dangerous event. Again, you can also try howling.
Or yelling into a pillow, or howling into a pillow to help to regulate those emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, go into your shower stall and just let out a big whoo, a big howl.
Or in your car, like whatever.
In your car works. But it's interesting to see how other animals metabolize stress and trauma, and you can borrow some of that.
I think we all find our way. For me, it is being in nature and walking. I walk a lot, not only for the metabolic benefits, for the connection, but really to regulate. I've shared on the show that I came from a lot of abuse, and I just ultimately was just I thought I was just type A. There's all these labels and these things that you are attached to you, and accolades that are celebrated for being a certain way. Oh, you always follow up, or you're always so dependable, or whatever whatever that may be. And I began to realize, with deep digging into the research after many diagnoses and inflammatory issues and autoimmune issues, I'm like, oh no, I'm just constantly in a state of deregulation. I just didn't know. You eventually you wake up and you realize like, oh no, you're not supposed to just constantly be on alert all the time. And and I think for me, it's my what I call kind of the deepest patterning. It feels like so survival makes sense. And so I have all these little strategies. I'm not howling. I should try.
Try it. Well, I think this is part of, doing your biopsychosocial intake form, if you will.
Yeah.
Yes, you can do that with a therapist or with a doctor, but you can also do that kind of personal inventory on your own. You can do it immersed in nature on a long walk where, again, the aperture of your attention seems to be more open, feel kind of more connected to the world around you, etc. And you can get very honest with yourself. I mean, for me, candidly, before I could actually even consider fasting or cold therapy or light therapy or resistance training, I actually had to get more honest about who I was and who I thought I was. I was a chronic people pleaser. This really emerges from, a childhood that was both wonderful but full of challenges. I was a very, very chubby kid, kind of moving around the world. I lived in 11 different places before I was 7, so I was always in a new school, often in a new language. So I was always completely focused on fitting in and willing to sacrifice all and every bit of my authenticity for some sort of fleeting sense of belonging, as children will often do. And I carried that into my adulthood, to essentially please everyone around me all the time and to base my self-worth through the eyes of others. And essentially think I was just the chubby kid who would do anything to be liked. And, my fate was written in the stars. That was kind of my genetic destiny is, just to be this chubby kid that would never be good enough. And to get really honest with myself there was, I would say, the precursor, the preamble to the more kind of physiological journey.
So it was digging into those beliefs that maybe unconsciously you were holding on to.
Oh, well, I mean, totally, 100%. And then realizing on some level, and this was more of a spiritual component of my rebirth, if you will, that change was possible. That the Buddha had this revelation 2,500 years ago under the Bodhi tree, without the luxury of a microscope, that we are completely impermanent beings, changing moment to moment in relationship to our environment, that we're constantly in flux, that there is no product to being me, that I am just simply process. And this really violated my sense of self because every morning I wake up, I go in, I look at myself in the mirror, I suck in my substantial gut, and be like, oh, well, there's Jeff. He looks more or less the way he did yesterday. And that physical continuity sort of tricks us into believing that there is a stable, reliable self. But in fact, there is no real self. You are just a form changing moment to moment. And then, I like science, so I started to put empirical value to that spiritual satori of like, well, I'm made of 7 octillion atoms, mostly hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, a few other ones. And I'm experiencing 37 billion chemical reactions per second.
It's a lot.
And I have
It's miraculous.
39 trillion bacteria snuggled down in my colon that's turning over every 4 minutes to 24 hours. I'm literally not the same person that started this podcast. And that awakening to your impermanence is actually very, very empowering and a little bit scary, but empowering to know that if you really truly embrace yourself as process, then you can adopt the behaviors and the environment that alter the trajectory of that process towards healing, towards becoming more whole. And that's what I did.
Thanks for sharing that journey.
Yeah.
And then I'm glad we went deeper into
Yeah.
the beliefs and how our childhood plays into this. Not only modern life happening and us kind of succumbing to the way that we're living our modern day life, but then also how our beliefs play into what we believe to be true about our identity and how that plays into the way that our nervous system regulates. and how it's all up for review. We get to redefine who we want to be. Like you said, you changed. Both of us have changed since we started this.
That is the resurrection that is always available to you. I think once you embrace it, and I mean, it violates much of what we've been taught about genetic determinism. And, you know, again, genetics play a very, very important role in our morphology and other components of what it is to be alive, and certain processes and mechanisms that humans are subject to. But, for the last 50 years of the 20th century, we were essentially alloyed to the idea that, our fixed underlying nucleotide sequences essentially determined disease. Right. And if we could map them all, we could put our thumb on every disease and then be able to, address them. And of course, we discovered largely through the Human Genome Project, but also with the kind of emergence of epigenetic, that it is as much, if not much more, our environment that determines our fate. It's epigenetics, essentially the expression of our genes in relation to our environment, that is really the mitigator of the trajectory of our health. And so that was a very important awakening. And I think it's one that's really important because, as you say, sort of we become the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves so often. And that idea of being a story, of being a fixed, immutable story, is sort of anchored in that idea that I can't change, that my destiny is written in the stars or written in my genes. But, we've discovered through epigenetics and microbiome and neuroplasticity that we're always changing. We're always changing. So don't listen to your boyfriend or girlfriend when they say, you'll never change. You'll be like, I'm always changing.
or people who are, their diabetes is familial. And not to say that there isn't in
Right.
situations that is the case,
Sure.
but we have a lot more people getting diagnosed with that than ever had family members with it. I worked on the Human Genome Project on chromosome 21.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And yeah,
Amazing.
in the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in 2002, I think. And it's, I remember that project, it was being assigned to all these different labs and decoding it, and just it was going to be the answer. We
Yeah.
were going to learn, and then
Yeah, well,
well, we
and it
learned
was
something.
yeah, well, and it is the answer in some cases, as you
Yeah.
say. I mean, oftentimes, our underlying genetics predispose us sometimes dispositively to certain kinds of disease. Nature, just the ultimate designer, but it makes mistakes in execution, and sometimes we call those mutations or, single nucleotide polymorphisms, et cetera, whatever you want to call them. But those are also, it's those very mutations that allows us to evolve, right? Because nature then selects for the best of those genes. And so, it's a very interesting on-ramp into conversation about nature, actually, because, as we were talking about before we started recording, we're often don't trust nature because, it comes up as pests and weeds, kind of like in the best situation. But we don't trust nature because we feel threatened often by it because, oh, it's out to get us. It's a saber-toothed tiger or a wild bear or, a giant sloth. And so, we best kill them all off, or it's a tiny little bacteria and a virus, the ones that we can't see. So we'll kill those off too, right? And so we don't trust nature because we think that it's out to get us. And we actually don't trust the part of ourselves that is nature so much of the time. And we call that human nature. And from an Abrahamic perspective, we've been taught that part of us is sinful and it's going to be reduced back to dust and it's susceptible to vice and pleasures of the flesh, etc. So we best sublimate it because there's a part of us that's eternal. We call that the soul, and that's the better part of us. That's the angelic part of us. So we tend to not trust nature, but it's funny. I don't mean to kind of hawk my book at all, really. But like on the cover of my book, which I have here, I have, just because it speaks to this very idea, there is a sort of grass, couple blades of grass growing through sort of an endless pavement. And I'm sure you've experienced that sometime when you're walking kind of in an urban landscape and you look down and you're like, oh my God, a flower has grown out of the sidewalk. How is that even possible? And this is like an unbelievable place to put our faith, not as sort of belief in the absence of evidence, that kind of faith, but more like trust in the eternal reliability of nature to thrive and to grow. And that is also within us. We are that blade of grass growing through the pavement of the sidewalk. And so to trust yourself as nature, fully to just surrender to yourself as nature is something that I found to be kind of a spiritual part, a journey that is both kind of psychological and physical.
And I think in healing as well.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's a beautiful healing journey. Yeah, I'm very excited about the book. I shared that I got a chance to read the first couple chapters, and I'm so excited to dive deeper into it. What do you hope a reader like myself gets from this beautiful book?
Yeah, well, certainly there is kind of the how to,
The how to,
there
the
are
prescription. Yeah.
the prescriptive element of it, which is, filled with what I call these good stress protocols. Sometimes I call them the protocols of inconvenience, but, getting more comfortable with discomfort. And that's not just a physical thing, but it's also a social and psychological thing. I talk a lot about the importance, for example, of having stressful conversations, the ones that we tend to avoid, but the miracle that sits on the other side of those stressful conversations is just unbelievable. The world that we imagine is possible is over there if we can lean in to having hard, thorny conversations, particularly with the people that we love. So I talk about protocols for that. I talk about protocols for having social fitness, in the same way that we go to the physiological gym and stress a bicep and for it to grow. And we also need to actually now build our social muscularity, if you will, because we live in this society of loneliness and individualism. So there's, the hardcore kind of how to empirically backed, evidence anchored stuff.
My favorite.
That's in there. But I also really, I spend really the first half of the book really trying to approach well-being from a more philosophical perspective. It's sort of in some ways, not as much the how of wellness, but the sort of why, the understory, a more philosophical approach to how the human body works as nature. So there's really two goals, I suppose. One is like, hey, here are some prescriptive things to do. And here's also a way of understanding well-being.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are going to really appreciate not only having the prescription, sure, but also understanding the why it matters to them, and not just for health, but overall, like, again, aliveness, connection, meaning. And then ultimately just, I think the intention, I know for me, when I think about what I would love is to do the things I love with the people that I love. Like be in joy and gratitude and have the resilience and the aliveness, the mitochondrial capacity to do that, to get to do that, at any stage of my life. And I feel like that's a lot of, so much more that you're bringing to the table in this book. But that was kind of a glimmer of what I felt when I read listened to the first two chapters.
Yeah. 93% of us, right, are metabolically dysfunctional. What does it actually really mean?
What does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah. It means that we're not making energy well, really. And if you kind of break that down, you understand that what we really are is animated information, and our lives are rounded kind of by a final sleep, if you will. But while we're here right now, how brightly will we shine? That's the main question. And it's funny, like sometimes I explain this to my children this way. I have like a lighter, and a lighter you can ignite a lighter. And really what that is a chemical reaction between oxygen in the air and a carbon fuel source. So in the case of a lighter, it's butane, which I think is C4H10, for those curious. And what is the byproduct of a lighter? Well, you see that flame, but that's really heat, water vapor, and carbon dioxide. Well, you and I were very, very similar to that lighter in many ways. We take in oxygen, we combine it with a carbon fuel source, in our case, C6H12O6, that's glucose anyhow. And what do we produce? We produce heat, water vapor, and carbon dioxide, just like a lighter. Mm-hmm. But you've always seen, a lighter that's kind of throwing off a vibrant flame, right? And then you've also seen a lighter that's just barely a flicker. So what are you going to be? Are you going to be that vibrant flame? Are you going to shine brightly, or are you going to be just merely a flicker? And what is so empowering, that gives us so much agency, is there's so much that we can do to be that vibrant flame, to shine brightly while we're here, and to really play kind of a vital role within the greater context of this web of life. So, that's what I hope people really take away, is that we living kind of in this age of agency, if you will. That there's so much that we can do moment to moment to shine brightly.
I love that so much. That feels so good. Well,
Yeah.
Jeff, honey, thank you. I'll have the link in the show notes. The book's called Good Stress. It's going to be everywhere. Books are sold. Where else
Yeah.
would you love us to find you?
Yeah. Well, what I'm probably most proud of is what I've been able, in conjunction with my brilliant team at Commune, is to create with Commune. I mean, for those who are not familiar with Commune, we are essentially a platform that brings together some of the greatest and most inspired teachers and authors and integrative functional medicine doctors, et cetera. So that's at onecommune.com, ONE commune.com. And if you go there, you can just sort of discover, more than you'd probably ever be able to ingest in terms of inspiration and prescriptions for health and happiness. And it's really been the project of my last 6 or 7 years. To build that. It's based on a 10-acre laboratory, which is a retreat center and a production facility up in Topanga, California. And fortunately, it's been spared from the recent fires by the heroics of the LAFD and other renegade first responders, which tend to live in Topanga. There's some great stories about that. And then I'm sort of waxing alternately poetic and pathetic on Instagram at Jeff Krasno, just my name. So that's where you can find me.
Perfect. Well, I'll have all of that included in the show notes. And Jeff, honey, it has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing not only the kind of the mission of this beautiful book, but then also just your own journey in the process.
Yeah, thanks. So great to be with you. And I really appreciate your generosity. You do really just an admirable job of propping other people up and showcasing and amplifying their work. And it's really a beautiful reflection of your spirit. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you are ready to learn more about perimenopause and how to navigate with a lot of ease and grace, be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you can join our community. Don't forget to share this video with someone that you love, that you know is navigating the perimenopause journey as well, because they deserve to feel their best too. See you in the next video.